everyone, and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I'm your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's delve right in to study some Jewish history together. So tonight we pick up with the conclusion of the Great War, now known as World War I, which ended on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in the year 2018. Now, this war was unmatched in its carnage and its devastation from any war that had preceded that, because as most wars do, they combine whatever the modern technology is together with the tactics of war, and this had the elevated issue of being a war between virtually all of the countries in the world. And it left Europe in shambles, specifically France, where the greatest part of the war was fought. Half of France was just ravaged. Belgium was almost completely ravaged from when the Germans invaded Belgium. And then many other places on many other fronts in the war. We mentioned the Mesopotamian campaign. This left the old Yishuv and the new Yishuv in Jerusalem and Israel. The population of Israel was devastated, Northern Africa, many parts of the Middle East, and then many parts of Russia, where was the Eastern Front before the Russian Revolution and Russia gets out of the war. So many parts of the war at this point are physically devastated. Millions of people were killed, and it was just, people thought that this was the war to end all wars, and this would really be the end of war. That was the thought, at least before the Paris Peace Conference, when when everything was thrown into a complete shambles after the war. But what happens going into the end of the war is we see that even though America played a very interesting role in World War I, because up until America's entrance, really towards the end of the war in 2017, Woodrow Wilson was trying to play a neutral role. He was trying to play peacemaker, and he thought he was going to be able to set the world on a new course of peace. And Wilson, in many ways, is remembered as a wonderful person, and in many ways was remembered as a terrible president. Because on one side, he was completely idealistic, he was brilliant, but on the other side, he was also very autocratic. He rarely took advice from anyone, including his cabinet, and he thought he knew what was best. So on January 8th, 2018, he gave a speech to Congress known as the 14 Points, where he made 14 points for his vision for the end of the war and the future of world democracy. And just to summarize his 14 points, in it he said that there would always be open diplomacy without secret treaties, because one of the things that led to World War I was all the treaties, both known and secret, and even during the war, and at the time when Wilson was saying this, there were many secret treaties being signed by different countries. So open diplomacy with no more secret treaties. Economic free trade on the seas during war and in peace. So there could be no blockade, no restrictions in the seas. All international seas would be open. Equal trade conditions. All countries would have equal trade conditions with one another. Decrease armaments across all nations. Again, that was one of the big things that led to World War I. All the buildup in armaments. There would be a decreasing in armaments after the war if Wilson got what he wanted. Adjust colonial claims. Basically, the end of colonialism. We'll see how that plays out, but the end of colonialism. That's one of the things that Wilson wanted. The evacuation of all Central Powers from Russia, and Russia would determine its own independence. Now that Russia was no longer a monarchy, and the Central Powers, mostly Germany and Austria-Hungary, had gone in to conquer much of the former Russian Empire, they would all have to back out of all of those territories, and Russia would determine what it would do with those territories. Belgium would be completely evacuated and restored because Belgium was occupied by the Germans. The return of Alsace-Lorraine region to France. Now, Alsace-Lorraine was not conquered in World War I. It was conquered in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. It was one of the preludes to World War I. But the Alsace-Lorraine area would have to be returned to France. readjust Italian borders. Italy was all messed up during the war. Austria-Hungary would be provided an opportunity for self-determination. Again, the Habsburg Empire would be dismantled and the different pieces would fall to self-determination. Austria and Hungary become separate countries, and so would all the other small pieces of the empire. The redrawn borders of the Balkan region, this would create Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro. Now, if you remember, the lead up to World War I was the issues going on in the Balkans. As Otto von Bismarck said, there'll be some damn foolish thing in the Balkans that'll lead to war, and that's what happened. So the borders would be redrawn of the Balkans. The creation of a Turkish state, basically what we call Turkey nowadays. So it'd be the end of the Ottoman Empire, but there'd be a Turkish state that would have free trade in the Dardanelles. They wouldn't lose the Dardanelles as a path to trade. The creation of independent Polish state. If you remember, the Polish Empire had kind of fallen apart. They had at one point controlled Ukraine, Lithuania, many parts of what are now free states, but would end up under the Russian influence. And the Polish Empire basically broken between Austria-Hungary and Russia at this point. An independent Polish state would be created. The creation and the final step in Wilson's 14 points was the creation of a League of Nations. Now, the concept of the League of Nations is there would be an international democratic body that anytime there are disputes among nations, as opposed to having wars, you would come together in that international body, you would battle it out, and a decision would be voted on as to what the result of whatever the claim was. Now, the League of Nations was always virtually an impotent body, and its successor, the United Nations, is frankly, in my opinion, even worse. The United Nations, as we'll talk about in the later session, never has there been a more anti-Semitic body than the United Nations, or as I like to call them, the useless nations. They have disproportionately, in their 75, 80 years of existence, have passed, I should say actually their 75 years of existence, have passed more anti-Semitic laws and have had more resolutions against the State of Israel than any other country, including, North Korea, Iran, Russia, etc. And but it all started here with the first League of Nations, this concept of an international Congress, an international body, has never really amounted to much of anything. Again, that's painting a broad stroke and making a very broad statement, but maybe we'll talk about it a little bit more later. Okay, so these were Wilson's 14 points. Now, the Triple Entente, or what are now known as the Allies, resented America because, there are certain things they wanted. They wanted their colonies. They didn't want open seas, right? They wanted their empires. They felt like they fought Germany and Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans, and even though they happened to luck out with America coming in on their side, which made the difference in the war, they felt that they didn't want the war, and they won the war, and they still wanted their empires, and they still wanted their control of the seas. So they were not happy with the 14 points, but they needed America because America made the difference. Now, it's interesting. And even though the powers, both the Allied powers, of course, the Central Powers, did not like the 14 points, it definitely struck a chord in many places in the world because there was the idea of self-determination, that it'd be the end of empires and people would be able to have their own governments governing their own people. And when the whole thing will fail, when the whole League of Nations and the mandates and all these will fall apart, that will lead to the revolutions of the 20th century and on to the 21st century. And we'll see that even though this was a great idealistic plan, the failure and execution of it is what has led to the future bloodshed really after World War II. It will lead to World War I. It'll lead to World War II, and then subsequently everything after World War II. That is all a result of these 14 points and the failure in diplomacy that they were, and that they continue to be until this day. Now, what happens is, now there's another idea in Wilson's theology here that he felt Germany should be punished too hard. Now, did that mean that he felt that Germany wasn't guilty for provoking the war? Did that mean that he did not feel there was as much guilt and blood on Germany's hands as the Allies felt? That doesn't matter. He was really coming from another perspective, and that is that Germany, once their initial plan, the von Schlieffen plan, did not work. If you remember from last week, the von Schlieffen plan was they would quickly come in, decimate France, and Britain would stay out of the war, and they would turn to Russia and take care of Russia, and the war would be over very quickly, and all would be good. And they almost achieved it, but they didn't. When they didn't, the war, the next 4 years of the war, basically bankrupted the German economy. Now, the cost of the war was estimated at about $200 billion. Now, there was no way Germany could pay that, and the Allies couldn't even absorb that much money, right? That'd be more money than they would know what to do with. Yet, they felt, after the destruction the war caused, they felt Germany was guilty, and they thought Germany should pay for it. We'll see that Germany never ends up paying for that in any way, shape, or form. Now, beyond the reparations, which we'll get to, Germany far overextended itself financially in this war because if you remember from last week, they had banked on the von Schlieffen plan, which would have been a very quick rout of France, then gone on to Russia, and it would have been done very quickly. And when that didn't happen, when the 4-year war played out as it did, it destroyed the German economy. Again, we had the British blockade, which kept much needed supplies from the German people. There was starvation throughout Germany, and beyond that, Germany basically mortgaged its whole country to be able to keep fighting the war. They had billions of dollars of debts owed. They owed probably over $100 billion, and about a third of that was to America, by the way. Now, many of these debts were forgiven, but the economy was already crippled. So what Wilson knew, and rightfully so, is that if the reparations would be too hard on Germany, well, Germany was already financially broken. So, you can't suck water out of a rock. And that's essentially what he thought reparations would be. So as much as as much as the Allied powers, England and France at the lead, wanted them to absolutely destroy Germany once and for all, just totally destroy it. And essentially what would happen is then France and England could come in and just pick it apart. That was not what Wilson wanted to happen, and not what Wilson was going to let happen. Now, in the end, we'll see that the Treaty of Versailles will require Germany to pay about $32 billion in reparations. Now, that on top of the $100 billion they already owed, so that's basically $132 billion. Now, no democracy can deal with something like that. So this essentially put the Weimar Republic, which will be the government that will go into place after World War I, it made the Weimar Republic doomed to fail because there's just the inflation this was going to cause. No government could deal with it. Now, in the end, as we said, many of those debts will be forgiven, and Germany will only pay about 15% of that $132 billion, about $5 billion, because we'll see that France will try and enforce it. They won't be able to. The League of Nations will realize that Germany is broke. They'll delay it for, I think it was in 1931, they delayed it for 1 year. In 1932, they delayed it for a second year, and then Hitler came to power and annulled the Treaty of Versailles. So this money, most of it never ever gets paid back, and but this is how the attempt to get Germany to pay for the war happened. Now, another thing that was also part and parcel in the 14 points is with the idea of self-determination and the idea of minorities being able to have a certain amount of self-determination. The Jews saw in Wilson's words an endorsement of the Balfour Declaration. So if you remember, at this time in America, Jews are heavily, and for most of the 20th century, are heavily supportive of the Democratic Party. Wilson was a Democrat. A lot of the love of the Jews for Democrats will start with Wilson, and Brandeis was an appointee of Wilson, and they saw in Wilson's 14 points an endorsement of the Balfour Declaration. We'll see that America, in the end, will basically endorse the Balfour Declaration. So America really saw in Wilson a champion of the Zionist cause, somewhat directly, sometimes indirectly, but that's what they saw. Now, another thing that we saw that with the 14 points is that the Jews thought in Europe that they would be much better with smaller countries than the big empires. They thought somehow in dealing with small powers that a lot of the issues that the Jews had dealt with in the Russian Empire, that wouldn't exist anymore. But they were wrong. We're going to see, unfortunately, they were very wrong, because these small powers give way to revolutions, and Jewish blood is often left left in the wake of all of these. Now, Germany will initially reject the 14 points, as you know, because again, the 14 points are really made before, in an early stage, and Germany will reject it. And again, the relationship with Germany and America was, you have to remember where we are at this point, that before America gets into war, you had a situation where Germany thought that after the war ended with Russia, that they would win. Right? So when Wilson makes his 14 points, Germany still thought they had a chance of winning. They thought that now that they were able to move their whole army from the Eastern Front to the Western Front, their army had been split, now they can move everyone to the Eastern Front, plus they were now going to be engaged in unrestricted submarine warfare, which meant that German U-boats in the Atlantic would sink every ship they saw without warning, whether it be a military vessel or a merchant vessel. And also, they thought that before the Zimmermann Telegraph, and even after the Zimmermann Telegraph, that even though they're pretty sure America, after the unrestricted U-boats, unrestricted U-boat attacks would come in on the side of the Allies, the Germans made a miscalculation that the war would be over before America could ever mobilize an army and mobilize and train an army, because America did not have a very large army at this point. So that was what Germany was banking on, that they'd have all their army on the Western Front. They'd have the unrestricted U-boat attacks in the Atlantic Ocean to break the British naval blockade, and they'd be able to win the war before America ever was able to mobilize and get into it. Fortunately, unfortunately, depending on how we look at it, they were wrong. America did mobilize. America got there before the German U-boats could make a difference. The Germans' offensive with their entire army did not break through, and in the end, it is clear that Germany has lost the war. Now, what happens in Germany when this offensive fails, when the U-boats don't do what they had hoped they were going to do, is that it leads to the revolution in Germany. It leads to a German revolution. The Kaiser abdicates his throne and flees to the Netherlands, and that begins essentially what leads to the Weimar Republic. And now, what was interesting is at this point, when towards the end of the war, in October of 1918, Germany says that they will accept the 14 points. Now, they had already lost at this point, right? Their final offensive didn't work. The U-boats didn't work. The Kaiser had already abdicated the throne. They say, oh, we'll accept the 14 points. Now, Wilson, with his ego, was very, very touched by that. And because, he thought now he had everyone where he wanted them, and he could now bring world peace about with his vision of the 14 points. And because of that, when the armistice finally happens in November, it makes a vague reference to the 14 points, and that becomes the beginning of the discussion for the Paris Peace Conference. Now, the Paris Peace Conference begins in January of 1949 in the Palace of Versailles in Paris, and it results in several treaties. Now, the problem with, there are many problems with the Treaty of, with the Paris Peace Conference. Most notably is the Central Powers were not a part of it. So basically, we're going to have 4 treaties that are going to come out, and we will be presented to Germany, Turkey, and Austria-Hungary with no negotiations, like take it or leave it. Take it or we're still in a state of war. And, for anyone who's studied military warfare, that's no way to do it. Even after you have an armistice, and even if you have a clear loser, you still have to have negotiations to have your treaty. I mean, look at what we've been doing since 1948 with our Arab neighbors in Israel, right? We've won every war. We've had armistice. We've had ceasefires, but we only have treaties with Egypt and Jordan, and now, Baruch Hashem, with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, etc., through the Abraham Accords, but the armistice is not peace, and you can't just do it unilaterally. That was learned from World War I, because the attempt was to just present the treaties to the Allied powers. To the Central Powers. Now, the 4 leaders of the Paris Peace Conference were Woodrow Wilson, were Prime Minister Orlando from Italy, were President Clemenceau from France, and Prime Minister David Lloyd George from the United Kingdom. Besides for them, there were a total of 30 countries there that signed the different treaties, and there are 20 other delegates from other countries. Now, some are not invited. There were some countries who came uninvited to lobby for their interests, essentially, because, like Russia, for example. Russia was not a signer of any of these treaties, but they were there to lobby for their interests, because Russia was still in the midst of their own war, their own civil war at this point. Now, beyond these 50 countries that were present at the Paris Peace Conference, there were 3 non-government organizations. One of them was the World Zionist Organization, represented by Chaim Weizmann. Chaim Weizmann was at the Paris Peace Conference. Now, what is interesting is after the first round of the Paris Peace Conference, Wilson has a stroke. On October 2nd, 1919, Woodrow Wilson has a stroke, and from that point on, his presidency is essentially led by his wife. This is his second wife, because his first wife had already passed away, Mrs. Edith Wilson, who was a very powerful woman, and many I guess somewhat tongue-in-cheek, referred to her as the first female president, because for the remainder of Wilson's presidency, she will be essentially in charge of what gets through to Wilson. Wilson will basically end up bedridden after his stroke, and she will be the gatekeeper as to what documents can get into him, what messages get out from him, and will essentially manage the presidency for the remainder year and a half or year and a few months of Wilson's term. Now, that could never happen nowadays with media and whatnot. As soon as a president would have a stroke and become bedridden, the 25th Amendment would come into effect, and the vice president would become the acting president. But in 1919, you could get away with such a thing. So Edith Wilson, Mrs. Edith Wilson, will basically lead the country for the next year and a quarter or so. But because of this, what happens is even though there's a certain amount of achievement on the part of Wilson in the 14 points at the Paris Peace Conference, it still needed acceptance from countries, and it needed implementation, and it would need acceptance within America and implementation within America. And Wilson is bedridden. He can't lobby for it. He can't travel around. He can't do the work that is necessary after the treaty. And because of that, we're going to see that America will go into a strict isolationist policy until really Pearl Harbor, until late into World War II, or 2 years into World War II. And a lot of that is because Wilson could never do the groundwork after these treaties to make them really go into effect. And because of that, this is an interesting trivia question, America will never join the League of Nations. So you can ask, what major world power was not a part of the League of Nations? And that was the United States of America. The United States of America never joins the League of Nations, and frankly shouldn't join the should drop out of the United Nations at this point. But that's a different point. Yeah, you can start to get the idea of how I feel about the United Nations, can't you? Anyhow. The treaties that come out of the Paris Peace Conference are, first of all, the Treaty of Versailles. That's the famous one, or I should say the infamous one. That is signed on June 28th, 1919, a few months before Wilson's stroke. And that is the one that lays out the plan for Germany, for what will happen to Germany, the reparations to Germany, what will happen to the different holdings of the German Empire, and how what the aftermath of the war for Germany will be. Okay? Then we have the Treaty of Saint-Germain, which is signed September 10th, 1919, again, about a month before Wilson's stroke, and that's what lays out the plan for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for the Habsburg Empire. Then on November 27th, we have, this is after Wilson's stroke, so I don't know how involved he was at this point, but we have the Treaty of Novae, which talks about what will happen in the Balkans, and the final treaty that comes out of the Paris Peace Conference is the Treaty of Trion, which is signed on June 4th, 1920, and that is what will happen with Hungary. So again, the treaty I referred to before is just about the Austrian part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and this is what is about the Hungarian part of the empire. I'm sorry, there's one more. The Treaty of Sèvres, which is signed on August 10th, 1920, and then after that, it's amended with the Treaty of Lausanne on July 24th, 1923, and that's what deals with the Ottoman Empire. So these are the different treaties that are signed after the Paris Peace Conference, as part of the Paris Peace Conference, to draw the plan for the new world order that everyone hoped to be in effect after World War I. Now, one of the things that happened as a part of this conference was the mandates. Now, what the mandates were was you had a situation here where Wilson wanted to do away with colonialism. So instead, sort of the in-between state was the idea of a mandate. So a mandate was not a colony. The idea of a mandate was that different powers would administer or control an area for a period of time until that area could have its own self-determination and build a government and build a country. So it'd be like a stewardship to be able to build up the area into a country. Again, we're going to see in most places it really didn't work, and it really led to a lot of the problems that we've dealt with in the middle to latter part of the 20th century into the 21st century. Because what happens is the empires, essentially of the Germans and the Ottomans, are just distributed out amongst the winners. And but what'll happen is that what'll happen is that this will actually end up being a good thing for the Jews. Let me just get to a few more points before we talk about that. So one of the secret agreements that happens during the war is the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was between France and England, and it was in 1916 in the heat of the war, when it wasn't clear what was going to happen. This was just after the Ottomans actually got into the war, and it was basically a plan to divide up the Ottoman Empire. Like they were pretty clear at that point the Ottoman Empire was going to fall apart, and somehow they figured that they would be able to take their pieces for themselves. So already in 1916, 2 years into the war, 2 years before it ends, half right in the middle of the war, the Ottomans had just come into the war thinking that by coming into the war they would be able to gain something out of it, as we talked about last week. Well, France and Britain have already decided after the war how everything's going to be divided up. And basically they say, okay, in areas that there's a little bit more French influence, that'll go to France. In areas where the British essentially already were, that would go to the British. And we'll see in a moment what that leads to. Okay, so as a result of all these treaties, we have the mandates, as we'll discuss in a moment, how those divided up, and we also have a number of new countries that are established in the world. So what we have in Europe, first of all, the countries that were previously part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We have Czechoslovakia, we have the Kingdom of Serbs, which is the Croatian, Slovenian, and Bosnian parts. We have Austria, and we have Hungary, and we have Poland, which were at least the Galicia part of Poland. All those used to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Those are all now new countries. Now we have new countries that are previously part of the Russian Empire. We have Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, at least the northern and eastern part. And we have Finland and the eastern part of Poland. With the exception of the latter two, Finland and Poland, all those will end up being part of the Soviet Union within a few years. Now we have Ireland, which was previously part of the British Empire, which is broken off into its own country. And we have Iceland, which was previously part of Norway, which is its own country. Now, as far as Germany goes, we have the part of Poland and the Danzig corridor, which will, again, be part of the new Polish state. We have Czechoslovakia, because a small part of that had been part of Germany. That's going to go to the Czechoslovakian state. Part of Lithuania, that was also part of Germany. And there are also many other little chunks of the German Empire that are cut off for other strategic purposes and given to other countries. We already mentioned Alsace-Lorraine going back to France, and many other small parts were broken off and given to different countries for different strategic reasons. Now, what are the mandates? The mandates are interesting. We have two different parts of the mandates. We have the mandates that were previously part of the Ottoman Empire and the mandates that were previously part of the German Empire. So for the Ottoman Empire, we have, first of all, the mandate of Syria and Lebanon, and the mandate of Palestine. Those are and also the mandate of Iraq. So what happens is that Syria and Lebanon are given to France. That's because France already had involvement in those areas, and those are given to France. Now, within the Ottoman Empire, that was all one country, essentially. That was all one government within the Ottoman Empire. But Syria and Lebanon go to France. We all know that the mandate for Palestine goes to the United Kingdom, and the mandatory Iraq also goes to the United Kingdom. Now, the mandate for Palestine, the Palestinian mandate, was modern-day Israel and also modern-day Jordan. So after World War I, when Britain takes control of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, it includes a swath of land that is actually larger than biblical Israel. Because biblical Israel includes, if you go back to a biblical map, it includes the modern day state of Israel, for the most part, and then also includes an area in Transjordan, which was for 2.5 tribes that were on the eastern part of the Jordan River. And so that and more is included in the mandate for Palestine. And so at least for the next few years after the war, when we talk about the Zionist movement and a Jewish homeland in Palestine, that's the land that's being talked about. So it's significantly larger than what the Jews end up with, even what we've ended up with so far today. But that's what we're talking about when we talk about the mandate of Palestine. It's modern day Israel and modern day Jordan. Okay, that's what happens to the Ottoman Empire. That's how the Ottoman Empire is divided up, at least in the Middle East. Now, then we have all the lands that previously belonged to Germany. We have the Belgian Mandate for East Africa, so that's part of East Africa that was controlled by Germany, now goes to Belgium. We have the British Mandate for East Africa. We have the British Mandate for Cameroons. We have the French Mandate for Cameroons. We have the British Mandate for Togoland. We have the French Mandate for Togoland. We have the Mandate over German. Okay, so all that's Africa, right? That's all the German possessions within Africa. We mentioned last week or the week before, I don't remember, that the European powers had all been vying for pieces of Africa for the resources that were contained within. So everything that Germany controlled in Africa was now divided up essentially between France and Germany, with a little bit going to Belgium. We have the mandate for German possessions in the Pacific Ocean situated south of the equator, other than German Samoa and Nauru, which all goes to Australia. We have the mandate of Nauru, which goes to the United Kingdom. We have the mandate for the German possessions in the Pacific Ocean lying north of the equator. They go to Japan. And we have the mandate for German Samoa. That goes to New Zealand. We have the mandate for German Southwest Africa. That goes to South Africa. So what's interesting here is when we often talk about mandates, we really talk about France and United Kingdom, because we really think of the Middle East and how this mandate system utterly screwed up the Middle East and led to so many of the problems that we have today. Literally, all the struggles in the Middle East, the war in Syria, Iraq, Iran, all this stuff, it's all because of the French and the British and the mandates and how they arbitrarily drew lines and divided it up and put governments into place and wanting them to be part of the empire, and then the rebellions and the revolutions against their empires. That's what we think about. We think about France and the United Kingdom in the Middle East. But what's interesting is there were all these other mandates in other parts of the world, and how even Belgium, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand had little pieces of mandates as well after the war. Okay, so that's the mandate system. These are the countries that were developed after the war, and this whole situation, because it becomes a tinderbox. We talked about the tinderbox that led to World War I. Well, this whole situation just makes the tinderbox that first will lead to World War II, because it'll bring Germany literally to its knees, and it'll make Germany ripe for revolution, and it'll become a question: who's going to succeed in Germany? Will it be the Nazis, Yamach Shemam, or will it be the communists? And that'll be a struggle, because it'll be very clear by the time the late 20s and the 30s roll around that Germany will end up either as a socialist country, or a communist country, as part of the Russian influence, the Russian sphere of influence, or will become the National Socialist country, the Nazi country that it becomes. And it's actually fascinating how when Hitler comes to power, how all of those communists very quickly kind of fall into place to get power, to get their piece of the pie under Hitler, and their socialist values go completely out the window to be part of his fascist empire. But we'll talk about that when we get there. But really, this makes this bringing Germany to the knees after the war, not lighting up, not doing enough to really support the Weimar Republic. That's what'll lead to World War II happening just 20 years after World War I. So really, if we want to look at the proving ground, essentially, to bring about the Nazis in World War II, it was the debacle of Treaty of Versailles. It was, like we said, it was presented to the Germans with no German input, no negotiation. They were never called. They were presented, and they said, sign or we'll still be at war. And it was no good. It was no good all around. And we'll talk about as Hitler, Yamach Shemo, rises to power, how it was done in the really on the coattails of the Treaty of Versailles, because really all Germans hated the Treaty of Versailles. The German Democrats, the communists, and the Nazis, which were the three main parties, they all hate the Treaty of Versailles. And every politician that will be elected in Germany for the next 20 years will all be elected on a platform of annulling the Treaty of Versailles and pulling out of the Treaty of Versailles. So the Treaty of Versailles had no chance of success within Germany. And frankly, the British and the French didn't like it either, because they wanted Germany torn apart completely, and that is not what happened. So I think history has definitely recorded the Treaty of Versailles as a complete diplomatic debacle, which had the situation been handled differently after World War I, quite possibly World War II could have been averted, and all of the revolutions and wars and bloodshed of the 20th century maybe could have ended up slightly, or maybe quite different. But that is just one of the great what ifs of history that we always do. Okay. In a letter dated January 26, 1919, Chaim Weizmann addresses the General Arthur Money, who was the head of the British military administration in Palestine, that now he himself, General Money, was an anti-Zionist, as was the whole British military establishment, and he warned him that unless world Jewry secures a place for their own, there will be a terrible catastrophe. So in almost prophetic words in this letter just at the end of the war, January 1919, Chaim Weizmann tells the British, we need a homeland or it's going to end up really bad for the Jews. He saw it almost in a prophetic vision. No one knew it would happen just 2 decades later, but that is what happens. So as the British mandate opens in Palestine, we have an interesting situation, because we had the influx of Jews that we had been talking about in previous sessions before the war, and at that point we had almost 100,000 Jews in the country compared to about 600,000 Arabs. Now those Arabs were mainly Muslim Arabs, but there were also some Christian Arabs, and they all were opposed to the Jews being there. They were all opposed to the Jewish state. Now, after the war, there's only going to be about 60,000 Jews left in the country, out of about 600,000 total. So that'll be a drop from roughly 13% to about 10%, and that's because of, as we said, everything. The community was decimated, the hunger, the famine. Many Jews left. Many Jews were killed, and killed by the Ottomans, and killed in the war. And so if anything, while during the war, the Zionist movement made a big advancement in the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration is absorbed into the British mandate. It's written into the British mandate. It's accepted by the League of Nations. It'll be accepted by America by an act of Congress. So political Zionism took a huge step forward, but practical Zionism, the idea of coming to the country and settling the country, well, that took a step back, because the Jewish population in the country will go down during World War I, and both the old and the new yeshiv will be torn apart, and it'll take a lot of work to really get things back together. Now, a big problem after the war was, even though political Zionism had a certain amount of wins to flex at this point, the British military government that initially is in charge of the land of Israel is not in favor of political Zionism, and is not in favor of the Balfour Declaration, and is not in favor of the Jews, and they are going to do everything possible to try and undermine the Balfour Declaration. And initially, after the first year or two after the war, they're the ones that will control Israel. Now, at this time, we have a person come onto the scene by the name of Haj Amin al-Husseini, Yamach Shemo, who is a Palestinian nationalist, an Arab nationalist, a Muslim nationalist, whatever you want to call him. And he will be someone who, from the get-go, is very against the idea of Jews settling in Israel. He will be very against the idea of Jews ever having a homeland in the land of Israel. And he is really our first anti-Jewish. He's the beginning, really, of organizing anti-Jewish sentiments within the Arab world. Now, he will start to organize groups of fedayeen, which are basically suicide bombers, and they will terrorize the Jewish communities in 1919 and 1920. And there'll be Arab riots throughout Israel, throughout Jerusalem, Jaffa, throughout the whole country, throughout 1919 and 1920. About 200 Jews will be killed, 200 Jews will be seriously wounded, and this is while the Paris Peace Conference is going on. Now, the Jews, the Yishuv, and anticipating this response of the Arabs and starting to get wind of it, they actually organized a defense system. Now, this defense system was led by none other than Zev Jabotinsky, who would become the leader of what we call revisionist Zionism, which later becomes known as the Likud Party or the right-wing party of Israel. And he organizes essentially Jewish battalions or Jewish self-defense groups to fight against the Arab uprising. Now, he was part of the Jewish battalion that served with the British during the First World War. There was a Jewish battalion located in Palestine that fought with the British against the Turks, and Zev Jabotinsky was part of that battalion. So that's just an interesting point over here. Now, because at least the Jews got the advance word on this, and we had Jabotinsky's protection and resistance, it wasn't as bad as it could have been. It could have been a lot worse, because what happens is that in the age-old system of pogroms, that the Arabs start to attack, and the British just show up kind of late, similar to when a Russian pogrom would happen. The Russian police just wouldn't show up, and the pogromers could take their antics as they wanted for a couple of days, and that's what the British do over here. So by the time the British show up and they actually start making arrests, they'll arrest both Arabs and Jews. They'll arrest Hashmin al-Husseini, and they'll arrest Zev Jabotinsky, and Zev Jabotinsky will be sentenced with hard labor and then deportation. I think 15 years of hard labor and imprisonment, and then deportation from the country was his sentence. And that's the situation we have with the temporary military government of Israel. Now, we have the next chapter in Israel is very interesting, because enters a man by the name of Sir Herbert Samuel. Now, Sir Herbert Samuel was a member of the Liberal Party in Britain, and he had been very instrumental in the Balfour Declaration. He was a Jew. He had actually been raised as an Orthodox Jew, was now, I guess we call a traditional Jew, not completely observant, but still connected to his traditional Jewish upbringings, and he had been very instrumental in the Balfour Declaration, and he's appointed as the first High Commissioner of Palestine for the British. And what's interesting is many of the British thought this was terrible. Many of the Arabs thought this was terrible, because what in the world were the British doing appointing a Zionistic Jew as the High Commissioner of Palestine? Now, the optics of this did not look good for the Arabs, and Sir Herbert Samuel arrives in Israel with much fanfare, with a 17-gun salute, with endless speeches from the chief rabbi, Rav Yitzchak Kook, from every Jewish leader, and in June 1920 he comes to serve as the High Commissioner for a period of 5 years. Now, when he's appointed, either the first Shabbos or one of the first Shabbos he was there, he walks with his wife to the Chorva Shul in Jerusalem, which was the main shul in Jerusalem at that time, and it's Shabbos Nachamu, it's the Shabbos following Tisha B'Av, and he is given the Aliyah of Maftir, and he reads the Haftarah. So here you have the British High Commissioner reading the Haftarah in the main shul in Jerusalem. It is looking great for the Jews. It's looking like the Balfour Declaration is going to happen. The Jews are going to get their homeland in the land of Israel, and everything is to be ganz fine and dandy. The only problem is it wasn't, because bottom line is Sir Herbert Samuel was a British government official, and therefore, even though he was at his heart a traditional Jew and a Zionist and was very touched by the outpouring of emotion that and the excitement of his arriving in Israel, it doesn't play out like that. That's what happens a lot of times. I remember when Senator Lieberman almost became the vice president of this country, I was a young yeshiva student. I remember saying at that time, I don't know if this is so good for the Jews, because having a Jew in such a high government position, well, the Jew often has to try and appease both sides, and often in an attempt to show that he's not favoring the Jews, has to go above and beyond to really side with the opposite to show that he's not siding closely with the Jews. And my wife said that if you remember, shortly after President George W. Bush was inaugurated with his Vice President Dick Cheney, we had 9/11, and my wife said at the time, can you imagine what would have happened in a world of 9/11 with a Jewish Vice President of the United States? Like, that could not have been good. So it's almost like Hashem pulling the strings to make sure that Jew did not get into, as much as I respect Senator Lieberman, at least making sure he didn't get into that high office at that time. But anyways, so Herbert Samuel in the same way really attempts to appease the Arabs in every way possible, possible. He makes significant concessions to the Arabs. He actually communes the sentence of both Haj Amin al-Husseini, lets him come back to the country from exile, and lets Zev Jabotinsky out of prison. But what he does, he appoints Haj Amin al-Husseini as the Mufti of Jerusalem, which was the Muslim leader of Jerusalem. So he takes this man who had already been inciting riots against the Jews, who's our first, really Arab terrorist in Israel, and he makes him the leader of the country. Right? And an attempt to overextend to the Arabs and to try and seem balanced. So really in that move, in my humble opinion, if there's one move in history that had it been different, a lot of things could have ended up differently for Israel. I believe it was that. It was bringing Haj Amin al-Husseini back to Israel, giving him a leadership position, and really after that allowing the Arab nationalism to be fueled and built up over the next 20 years or 15 years until the outbreak of World War II. And without Haj Amin al-Husseini, maybe things could have been a little different. Now, this is the common mistake that's made often in history and this is a mistake that's made with Hitler, Yamach Shemo, is that many people think, okay, we'll get him into the position and then we'll have him right where we want him, we'll be able to control him, he'll be out in the open. Well, that's not what happens with Hitler, we know, and that's not what happens with al-Husseini either. Now, the other thing that Herbert Samuel does to try and appease the Arabs is he slows the pace of immigration. After the war, immigration to Israel was pretty much open, but right away, Herbert Samuel will shut that down, and we'll see that will eventually lead to the white paper about 10, 15 years later, which will totally shut off immigration to Israel, but he'll at least try and slow down the pouring of Jews into Israel after the war. So basically, all this really upsets the Zionists. They believe he goes too far to appease the Arabs, and he is not remembered as someone favorable, Sion on the Jewish side, Sion on the Arab side, because the Arabs didn't have any expectations. They're very worried about it, but they didn't get what they wanted, and for sure the Jews didn't get what they wanted from Herbert Samuel. Now, already this time we see the Arabs following the great adage of Ambassador Abi Ibn, where he said the Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, and that already happens in the time of Samuel. That with all of Herbert Samuel's overextending to the Arabs reject it all. Now, one of the things that Sir Herbert Samuel proposed was that Palestine should be governed by a joint Jewish and Arab council. Now, at this point, there's maybe 100,000 Jews, right? There's not even 100,000 Jews, and there's 500,000 Arabs. So if they had done the math and realized the situation, that okay, we'll have a joint Jewish-Arab council. It'll be one Jew, it'll be 5 Arabs, or 2 Jews and 10 Arabs, whatever it'll be. We outrule them in numbers. Who cares what the Balfour Declaration, the British Mandate? Who cares what it all says? If we have a council of Jews and Arabs, it's going to be a democratic council, and we far outnumber them, so let's just accept it. We'll be done with the whole Zionist movement right there. But no, the Arabs reject it. They say, we're not serving on any council with Jews. And this is really the pattern of the Arabs from this point forward, right? Total rejection of dealing with Jews, and always fighting the last war. When the partition plan will come about by the League of Nations or by the United Nations after the war, the Palestinians will reject that and say, no, we want the council of Sir Herbert Samuel. Right? Now, if they accepted the partition plan, we would have been left with a totally indefensible state, and it probably wouldn't have survived very long. But Jews accept it. Arabs reject it. You go on to the War of Independence and the armistice lines. If the Arabs accept that, we have a military indefensible state. Jews accept it, Arabs reject it, and so forth and so on. 1967, Jews accept it, Arabs reject it. And they're always fighting the last war and always missing opportunities. Well, that starts now. If they just accepted Sir Herbert Samuel's joint council, there'd be no Jewish state, there'd be no Jewish presence, there'd be nothing. We'd be a minority, maybe still controlled by the Arabs, maybe not. Who knows what would be there now. But they reject that, and instead what Herbert Samuel sets up is he sets up a Jewish agency and a Muslim agency. But the Muslims never get their act together with their agency, so it never really happens, and the Jewish agency does, and it becomes basically a pre-government government. And we'll see the Jewish agency will just be rolled into the government of the state in 1948 when the state is established. Okay, in 1920, Winston Churchill, a fascinating man in history, a lot of interface with the Jews, and we'll definitely touch on when we get to World War II. Really just, any book on Winston Churchill, I've read a couple of them, is just fascinating, definitely a fascinating man. But at this point, he's rising in the British government, and he's appointed the secretary over He's appointed the secretary over the British colonies, the British colonial secretary, and now Churchill is a staunch Zionist. But he is also a staunch British imperialist. In fact, even in World War II, he said that basically he had no intention of giving up the Queen's Empire after the war. Right? He thought that when he was fighting World War II, he was fighting it to protect the British Empire and had no intention of giving up. And at that point, the British Empire had already shrunk a lot from where it was after World War I. But he said, no, we're going to keep the British Empire forever. Okay, we all know the British Empire doesn't exist anymore. It's now a second-rate European power, very tiny, just over there on the island. But Winston Churchill was an imperialist at his heart, but was also a Zionist. Yet he comes into the situation in Israel, and as he himself said, with a stroke of a pen one Sunday afternoon in Cairo in 1921, I created the British Mandate of Transjordan. What he does with that is he essentially, in a unilateral move, breaks off Transjordan and makes it a separate mandate, separating it from Palestine. Now that was looked as a blow to the Zionists because it's, again, shrinking the land that they could possibly have for the future Jewish state. At this point, it didn't have a huge implication on the Jews because there weren't many settlements east of the Jordan River. There were a few, but not many at this point. But again, the idea was you're taking the whole land that we thought we were going to be able to build a Jewish state out of, and now you just cut it less than in half. And he makes the Hashemite Empire of Jordan, the Muslim Empire, the Arab Empire of Jordan. He puts one of the Hashemites. Hashemites always means a descendant of Muhammad's family. And he puts King Abdullah as the first king of Jordan on the throne. And it's still a part of the British Empire, but that's the beginning of the empire, the Kingdom of Jordan. Now, Churchill tried to appease the Jews by saying that it's fine what we're doing over here because we have to make an Arab state somewhere. So Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan will be the Arab state, and you'll have the rest of it for your Jewish state. Okay, we know it's also that doesn't happen. Now, if at any point that had been adopted, that would have taken care of also all the problems. If at any point the Hashemites of Jordan had said, okay, we're going to absorb, at this point, the 500,000 Arabs, take them into the Jordan Empire, we're going to build a nice, strong Arab empire in Jordan, you can have this piece of Israel, all would have been fine. That's what Churchill thought, or at least I should say, that's what Churchill made the Zionists to believe he was doing, but we all know how it plays out. So these are the interesting steps that happen in post-World War I world. None of it works almost none of it works with its intended goals, except for the work of the Zionists, which will lead to the Jewish state. But almost every other piece of the aftermath of the Paris Peace Conference, the different treaties, doesn't lead to a very happy situation for the world. As we continue in our next few sessions, we'll discuss it thoroughly, and I look forward to doing it with you. Everyone have a great day and a great week, and we will see you next time. Thank you so much for participating.